So I'm here with Dr. Rose Beiler from the UCF History Department. Dr. Beiler has been in the History Department since
1994.
1994, excellent. And she is working on a project in her research area along with the Center for Humanities and Digital Research here at UCF. And so I thought we would just talk to her and get a sense of what she's doing and how it fits in with her overall research agenda and so forth. So Dr. Beiler, can you tell us a little bit about your own background, your research background, your areas of work and that sort of thing?
Sure. So I'm a historian of early America and the early modern Atlantic world. And when I became a history major and got into history in the first place, I was really interested in stuff. And I was fascinated by old things, right? And so as an undergrad, I started working on public history, which is really all about the ways historians put history to work outside of the classroom, so in the world more generally, and worked at the New Jersey State Archives, and I worked at a historic house. And so when I went back to grad school, I never intended to be an academic. So I often refer to myself as an accidental academic. But I did go to grad school and I studied early American history. I was also really interested in putting my language skills to work. So I was a German minor as an undergraduate, and I was interested in figuring out how I could use those skills. I became fascinated by early America as I was working at the archives and at a historic house. And when I went to grad school, decided that I wanted to look at immigration. So my research is on the German-speaking Atlantic world. I'm really interested in the process of cultural adaptation and the ways in which people sort of define themselves when they are immigrants going to a new place. And I looked at German-speaking immigrants who were coming to the British colonies. So that's where I started. I finished my PhD in 1994 and I came to UCF. Right as a newly minted PhD student, not a student, graduate, graduate. And my first project looked at German immigration. My first book basically looks at a particular German immigrant who I'm using to sort of think about that process of cultural identity and how that changes in the process of migration. But from there, I then started looking into communication networks. So I became fascinated with the communication networks that I found this immigrant being involved in. I chose the immigrant I did because I had a stash of letters that he had written back and forth from Philadelphia to Germany. And for immigrants in the 1700s, that's very, very rare that you can find a run of letters. So I was trying to identify all of the people who were showing up in his letters, and in the process discovered that he was using the communication networks, well, or at least business networks, the people in his communication networks, I should say. I was identifying them by looking for them in church records, and they all were sectarians. So in the 18th century, what that meant was that there were a lot of them who did not participate as members of official state churches. So there were some Quakers, and there were some people who belonged to the Church of the Brethren, and there were some Mennonites, and these are all religious minorities in the 18th century. And really what got me into my second project was that I found that Wister, this immigrant I was writing about, was corresponding with a business associate in the Neckar River Valley in Germany, and he was asking to have his special-made hunting rifles imported with the household goods of German-speaking immigrants so that he could avoid paying duties on them. So they were basically smuggling them. But when he wrote to his business partner in the Neckar River Valley, he told him to go to a man in Mannheim who I identified as an elder in the Mennonite church to find immigrants who were traveling to Pennsylvania to bring his rifles with them in their household goods. And so I became really fascinated with his networks, right? Why was it that it was the people who were identified with these religious minorities who were the ones who had all the information for people who wanted to migrate to the British colonies?
This is really fascinating. I mean, in the digital humanities, we're interested in networks in a whole bunch of different ways,
Yes.
right? And so you're talking about access to networks that have that you have to make a lot of inferences about, right?
Yes.
I mean, you have quite limited information. I mean, I'm thinking, you know, other kinds of networks might have like extensive church records or extensive, you know, but you're using letters and municipal documents and what else do you use when you're trying to figure out these networks?
Good. So, so what I ended up doing was finding larger sets of letters that helped me to identify why these people were the ones who knew about migration opportunities. And then really what I'm looking at, the project I'm doing now has grown out of that. So now it's about the religious minorities themselves and their communication networks. But I look at everything I can lay my hands on, right? So I will always look to see if I can find vital statistics. So, you know, you start with the birth, marriage, death records, and in the 17th and 18th centuries, those were kept by religious authorities. And in the case of early modern Europe, they were official records that the religious authorities had to turn into the state. That's how they took censuses, that's how they knew about their populations. But because these are minorities, they don't necessarily always exist there. So I always start there when I'm looking for individuals. And the Quakers kept good records. So there I have, and they're preserved. The Mennonites from this time period, not so much. There I'm really just reliant on the letters that I uncovered in the process. So when I was trying to identify these people, what I discovered was that there were three major sort of religious groups that I focused in on, and there's an archives of letters, correspondence for each one of the groups. So the Mennonites, there were Dutch Mennonites who were helping Swiss exiles who were being banished from Switzerland to find resettlement opportunities. And so there's like about 1,000 letters that I have used there, and some of them will give you information, like they give demographic information about the migrants themselves, right?
So this has become the basis for your digital
Yes.
project,
Yes.
which you're calling Print.
Yes.
So can you tell us what print means and
Sure.
how the tools that you're using in a certain sense allow you to do things with this data and with these
Sure.
with these networks that you couldn't do just by sitting in a you know, in an archive or in a, you know, in front of a microfilm machine or whatever.
Sure. So PRINT stands for People, Religion, Information Networks, and Travel. And then I have sort of the subtitle, which is the dynamics of migration in the early modern world.
Okay.
And I started this project because I was trying to write up the book that I'm working on. So this grew out of a book, and I was having trouble visualizing the networks. So I was really interested, first of all, so I've got 3 sets of networks growing out of 3 different sets of correspondence. There's Quaker correspondence, there's Mennonite correspondence, and there's Pietist correspondence. And what I was seeing was that the 3 networks were overlapping and intersecting, but also the people who were writing to one another were constantly on the move. So both the people were moving and the points of correspondence, the geographic points, the locations of correspondence were moving, and then the intersections between the different networks, people were connected by 2 or 3 degrees of separation. So sometimes they weren't corresponding with one another directly, but they were several people removed, right? So I started trying to visualize this in a 2-dimensional way on a piece of paper, and had a terrible time doing it. So, so what Digital Humanities has done, I'm now using Gephi as a tool for doing network analysis. And I also really wanted to do 2 different things. I wanted to show how the networks evolved over time. So what I can see in the letters from the database that I've created is that the correspondence networks become much thicker. So in the mid-17th century when they begin, there are not a lot of letters in either case. But as time progresses, there's more and more correspondence as the networks become real networks. I mean, one can ask whether or not these are actually networks. And in a lot of ways, they're not stable networks at all. I think of them like a kaleidoscope. They're constantly, the people are in motion, but the connections between people are also constantly moving, right?
Well, and that may actually be more common for how many networks actually work. I mean, we think of networks in a certain kind of stable sense quite often, but when we're in the natural world, they often are unstable, changing, you know, maybe there's some stability, but some changing at the edges. So this might actually be a really
more.
interesting, more common
Yes,
model
yes.
in some ways. Yeah.
Well, I think it probably is, and I'm also really interested in the ways in which people identify themselves, right? So these are people from very different kinds of religious belief systems, and yet they're seeking people who have things in common with them. So they're not correspondence networks that continue over decades. They link up at this very particular point in time, I argue, that has something to do with what's happening at that time in the larger world, and it's mostly in Europe at this point in time that I'm writing about, right? So I'm interested in showing how the linkages change, the connections between people change over time, but I was really also very interested in showing the geographic shifts. And so, because my sense when I was writing up the data was that the Quakers had sort of a hub and spoke system. So Swarthmore Hall, where George Fox and Margaret Fell lived, was like a center, and everyone wrote to them. But the Mennonites have a much more elongated system that is not so directly connected to specific people, but is much more connected to sort of transportation centers, right? So Amsterdam is one of the major sort of centers, and there's a committee of people who are corresponding with people who are further up the Rhine in some sort of key places where there are Mennonite congregations, and they're also using a diplomat who's in Switzerland to communicate back and forth. So I was really interested in seeing the shapes of the networks and then how they are shaped geographically. So there's a spatial analysis to this too. So one of the things that I've been trying to do, but it's really difficult to do with Gephi, was to lay out these networks spatially and see how they change over time in terms of space.
So do you think, do you find any references to, I guess you could call them the more mainstream religious traditions? I mean, you just described these as all being kind of religious traditions on the borders or on the edges or in the margins. So we're not talking Lutherans, we're not talking mainstream Calvinists or Anglicans, so are they ever corresponding with those people, or are they just like non-entities?
Oh no, they're definitely corresponding with these people. So what happens is that these networks start out, I argue, evolving in response to religious persecution. And then they begin to overlap and intersect as the Quakers send missionaries into communities where they think there are like-minded people who will be open to their version of the gospel, right? But they are responding initially both in the situation of the Quakers and for the Mennonites, they're responding to religious persecution. And the best example I can give you is of the Mennonites, where the Swiss are being banished by the religious authorities. And there is a Dutch diplomat who is in Switzerland, who the Mennonites in the Netherlands, who have much more religious toleration, and they have a lot more sort of political clout, they begin to lobby the Dutch government to lobby the Swiss government to stop persecuting them. So there is a lot of conversation. The diplomat who's doing a lot of the correspondence and trying to negotiate back and forth and is their conduit for the information they have in a lot of cases, or one of the conduits. They're also, the religious leaders are corresponding. But the letters end up going with the diplomatic corps, which I find really fascinating, right? And that is an official church. It's the Reformed, I mean, the diplomat would belong to the Reformed Church and is Dutch, right? And the Swiss, who are persecuting them, are Reformed, belong to the Reformed Church as well. And so what you see in the case of the Anabaptists, the Mennonites, is that the Dutch States General send a letter to the city of Bern saying, please stop persecuting these people. They're just like us. They're good Protestants like us. We just disagree on a few things. And then the other place where you see mainstream churches, people with mainstream religious affiliations coming in, is that the Anabaptists then, as the Swiss government is not letting them go, their leaders and the Dutch Mennonites begin to sort of solicit resettlement opportunities. So at one point, the King of Prussia, they're negotiating with the King of Prussia to be resettled in Prussia, and they're trying to figure out what options they have at their disposal. So really the migration part of this story is that these communication networks, which really begin to deal with issues of persecution, then become channels for funding money, household goods, and also for finding resettlement opportunities for religious refugees. And there are also, like the letters lay out all of the logistics, like the ships that they're going to sail on and up the Rhine, down the Rhine on, and all of the passports that they need to get to be able to move through the many different political states, right? So there is a lot of use of, or there's a lot of appearance of other religious people from other religious backgrounds that show up, but also by the time you get into the 1710s and 20s, these networks have sort of taken on a life of their own. So by the time we get to the 1730s, where I get to Worcester, from where I started this project, everybody is using these networks. So the people that the Mennonite elder was giving information about how to migrate to Pennsylvania, they were German Reformed and Lutheran people. They weren't Mennonites any longer, right? So the origin of the network starts out being about religious persecution and about Mennonite work, but then it changes over time and it sort of takes on a life of its own. So part of what I'm really interested in, to get back to the networks, is that these networks are religious communication networks, but they're much more than that. So people were not only identifying themselves with their religious beliefs, they were also, farmers and merchants and ship captains and diplomats. And so the networks themselves, I think it's sort of one of our artificial ways of analyzing the past to break up people's identity and put them in little boxes to say they all belong to this religious group, or they're doing this for economic reasons, or this is about their political ideology, right? Where I think, we know this today as human beings. Things are much messier than that,
Messier,
right?
absolutely.
Yes.
So I'm interested then, you already mentioned using Gephi, and I'm interested in how you're capturing all this complexity in this digital project that you're working on. Like, what can you describe a little bit of what this project looks like, how you're working with the data, and what your goal is? Like, what are you trying to build?
Yes. Well, it started out about being about illustrations for my book, and now it is a project that has not yet come to fruition, but that is in its planning stages. So this project, in my ideal little world, when it is fully realized, if indeed we can fully realize it, what we will do is to create a database of the letters, and right now I have probably close to 3,000 letters from these three groups in a database where I don't have full text. I have the minimal metadata that I need in order to do the network analysis.
And are these letters in archives somewhere? Do you have to get permissions?
Yes.
Or okay.
Yes. So I have a number of archives, but there's sort of three major sets. One, the Quakers are in London, and then also partially in Pennsylvania. The Pietists are in Halle in Germany, and the Mennonites are in Amsterdam. And there are probably roughly about 1,000 in each by the time we're finished gathering the beginning stages. What we're trying to do is to create a repository of digital images of the letters. That's the first step, which we are then hoping to crowdsource the transcriptions of them, because they're all, of course, in 18th century handwriting. So they're not
German, mostly?
German, Dutch, and English.
Okay.
So it's a mixture, right? So it's a long-term project, that crowdsourced transcriptions. But we received a small fellowship to digitize 460 some letters from the Quakers that are in English. So we're starting with that as our prototype. So we'll build a repository, a digital repository database with the letters in them. But in my sort of dream world, you will access that database through data visualizations, network visualizations, and various kinds of visualizations. I'm most interested in the networks. But the front end will allow you to visualize the networks in different ways. So for me, there's a project called 6 Degrees of Francis Bacon that is sort of my ideal of how you might be able to sort of have a very fluid and flexible series of data visualizations, network visualizations, so that if you click on one person in the network, another whole set of visualizations emerge.
So you're thinking at one level the network would be who's writing to who?
Yes.
But then also who's referring to who?
Yes.
And those sorts of
Yes.
connections as well?
Yes.
Okay.
And the idea is that, those networks, if you from the front end clicked on the edge between the two nodes that represent the letter where somebody is either referenced or a sender or receiver, then you would be able to go directly from that to the digital letter, to the transcription of the letter, but then also to more information about those people. So, I think so there's on the front end the network visualizations and the possibility for researchers to do network analysis through those visualizations, right? But then also there is this back end data repository that, again, in my ideal world, would allow for text mining and allow for textual analysis as well, so that you could also access the letters through the data repository.
And when you're thinking about text mining, are you thinking about doing like markup on the texts, like a TEI kind of markup, or like, so in other words, kind of semantic searching?
In my ideal world.
Okay, in your ideal world, fine.
But here's
It's
what you
good
have to
ideas.
know,
It's good
Bruce,
to
is
have
that
ideas.
we haven't gotten to the, like we just applied for an NEH grant to
Right.
plan this.
Right.
So to me, I think I started out with the network analysis, so that's the important piece, and the visualizations. And I wanted to be able to have a user look at those networks, think about the different ways in which people were connected, and then go to the text and read the text for themselves. That's my first sort of priority, right? But if I'm going to go for it all, then yes, I would love to be able to have it tagged in TEI, like markup in TEI, so that people could also do more data mining with it.
Well, so this is really fascinating because, in a certain sense, it's not a single project we're talking about, but several levels, like Mark 1, Mark 2, Mark 3 kind of thing. So you have a kind of initial goal, but then you can see other kinds of connections. And I can imagine, I don't know how extensive other literature or other databases are out there on the 17th, 18th century. But is it possible to hook into some of their data and extend your networks even further?
I think it is possible, and I mean this gets to sort of the other question that I haven't completely answered, and that is how to tie into other projects. So one of the things that I'm also interested in, to get back to where I started, which is public history, is I would like this to not just be a digital humanities project, but a public digital humanities project. And for me, that means I need to be engaging wider audiences outside of the academy. And I think what really strikes me when I read the letters is that so much of the reason for the existence of these networks still exists today. So the issues that people were facing, these religious minorities were facing in the 17th century, nothing has changed. Our immigration crises today, on a regular basis, immigrants from religious minorities are facing the same issues. And so there's a part of me that, in thinking about, and this gets back to your question, there are like many digital humanities projects that I could potentially tap into. And I think some of it depends a little bit on, down the road, whether I want this to be a project about letters and correspondence, whether I want it to be about religious refugees, migration, so this is what I'm struggling with at the moment. And so this summer when I was in Germany, I went back and connected with several of my colleagues just to sort of test the waters and see. I have a friend, for instance, who works on Huguenots, who are French religious minorities, right? To see whether this is something that there might be somebody out there, they're religious minorities from the same time period. But so that would be an interesting sort of additional set of data to bring in and sort of compare and contrast. On the other hand, there are a number of projects that are about correspondence networks. And so if it's about, and then there are different projects about religion. So I'm not quite sure.
Many different kinds of possible connections here.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, there's a part of me that wants to simply, I have to sort of get a better
Right.
handle on,
Right.
you know, what are the other tools? Like,
Right.
we have not yet figured out the transcription
Mhm.
tool that we want to use. We really are looking at Leaflet for adding sort of geographic knowledge to the Gephi visualizations,
Mhm.
using Leaflet to show them geographically.
Mhm.
But we still need to think about
Mhm.
sort of the tools. But those are the questions, and those are the big questions that I haven't quite
Yeah.
answered. I think there are a lot of potential projects and directions I could go in, projects to play with and directions I could go in, but I'm not quite sure yet what they are.
Well, I'm interested in, you know, in you as a historian and getting you to think about or talk about what this adds to your toolkit as a historian, right? I mean, historians, at least traditionally, are not trained in these sorts of tools. You know, they're trained to go into archives. They're trained to, you know, do all the things that they have done. So why look towards these kinds of tools as a historian? Like, what does this add something? Does this add something to history in general? As clearly, it adds something to your area of interest.
Yes.
But you know, as a historian, what does this kind of thing add to the historian's toolbox?
Yes. I think it adds a great deal. I was stuck in writing my chapters on the shape of the networks because I could not figure out, I'm a visual person, and to me, I was seeing them in my head in particular forms, but I could not figure out how to show them on a two-dimensional form. And because of their fluidity, I could not demonstrate the ways in which their shapes shifted over time. So it seems to me that what digital tools add in this case is it allows me to do something that I can't do on paper, right? But also, and I haven't gotten quite all of I'm still doing a lot of data cleanup, and that's another whole topic. I didn't collect any of this data originally thinking about doing a visualization. So it's taken a lot of effort to go in and go back and add in all the data that was missing, that I didn't collect the first time around because it didn't matter at that point. But I think also that, that the tools, and I'm thinking here now again about the visualizations can help me to understand different things about the networks, right? They can show me different kinds of patterns that I might have missed. Why one person is such a key player who I might not have recognized as a key player, right, in the midst of all of this. So I think the tools can show me different patterns that lead me to ask new questions that take me back to the archives again to find different answers to, right?
Yeah, I think that's really, what you said is really important, because that idea that this is not just, you know, an answer to a question and it stops here.
Yes.
Right? I mean,
Yes.
you know, somebody once said that, you know, a great deal of interesting research starts from the basic observation of, that's weird.
Yes.
You know?
Yes.
And getting that, that's weird moment.
Yes. Yes.
You know, like something's not fitting here.
That's
Something's
right.
not adding up.
Yes.
You know, and it seems to me like that what you're doing with these digital tools is multiplying the opportunities
Yes.
for finding those,
That's exactly right.
that's weird moments.
Yes, yes. That's that that's weird moment that got me started in the first place,
Right.
right? And it keeps going.
Right.
And then I think, you know, what we do as historians is to try to understand why things happened as they happened. Why
Right.
did people make the choices they made?
Right.
You know, why was it that, you know, this merchant, Quaker merchant, is sending his reformed business partner to a Mennonite elder
Right.
to find immigrants going to Pennsylvania to smuggle his guns? There's so much wrong with that picture, right? So why are
Right.
all those people talking to one another?
Right, right.
And why are they doing what they're doing? It doesn't
Right.
make sense. And so, yeah, the digital tools, you're exactly right. It just multiplies those opportunities. And then I think the other thing for me that has become increasingly important, and the thing that for me has allowed me to sort of connect up what I think of as the schizophrenic parts of my life, that is the public history me and the academic me, is that the digital tools are allowing me here in Central Florida to think about connecting up my research in 17th and 18th century Europe and the larger Atlantic world with my interest in public history, which when I came here in 1994 and we didn't have digital tools, that ended up being local history. And so I have spent a lot of years involved in public history here where I was focusing on 20th and 21st century Florida history. But what the digital does is allows me to engage, and those tools allow me to engage a larger audience with that early modern history that is not Central Florida based, right? So my students have been engaged in transcribing in another digital project for the 18th century account ledgers. And to me, bringing my research to my students so that they can begin to understand what it's like to live in the 17th century, so that they can learn the skills of reading that handwriting and beginning to do analysis in those documents, and to hear the language of immigrants from the 17th and 18th centuries talking about their experiences. That opens up another whole world that to me is really important. So I think that the digital tools allow me, as an early modern scholar, to engage in public history. And while the students are in the classroom, like, my hope is that people in these religious communities today will become engaged with this material, like, who are not here, right, that are around the world.
Yeah, and I think, you know, I mean, what you say about public history is, I think, really important in the sense of rethinking our own disciplines, right? I mean, you know, historically, if we had thought about the public as either simply a source of information or you know, something to be studied or something like that, what we now have is the possibility that they're co-researchers, right? So in other words, you know, we academics are not the authorities, the smart ones, the trained ones. We recognize that those people there also have authority, also have training, also have really valuable stuff, and if we work in partnership with them, we get something very different from, here am I, the expert, and you people just give me the data.
Yes, and so crowdsourcing is the way in which, in this project, I want to do that, right? So, you know, there's an awful lot of genealogical information in these letters, right? And while that might not be the part that I'm looking at, that can interest somebody who's wanting to do their family history. So can I create materials? And that's one of the things we're doing right now, is creating a transcription manual and creating videos to teach people how to read the old handwriting and how to actually do the transcriptions, so that we can put them on the web, and anyone who has the interest can participate in that project. So I think that, you know, that is what I learned from teaching public history, is that, you know, really what we do as public historians, we might be the expert historians, but our local partners are the ones who are the local knowledge keepers. They know their own histories. We might know how to ask questions, we might know how to do the analysis, but they're the ones who can take us to the sources. They're the ones who can help us to find the information. And so thinking about how to engage other audiences and how to collaborate with them, to me, is just really important in all of this.
Well, so one final question, which is, if you, I mean, you talk about this stuff in your classes, and you're obviously interested in getting students involved in this sort of thing. So what would you tell a digital humanities student about getting involved in doing digital humanities work? Like, where do you even start? What should they do first? Should they find someone like you, or can they do it themselves, or what
all of the above. I think what I would say is, you know, first, you still have to be based in your discipline. So you have to understand how to do research. Like, for me, it's history. I have to understand what historical research is. And then the digital tools offer me another set of ways of actually answering the questions that historians ask, right? And then, so I would say, first, you know, learn the research methods of your particular humanities discipline. That's first and foremost. And it's different depending on whether you're a philosopher or a historian or a literary scholar, right? And then second, take every advantage you can. Work on it on your own, but seek out the faculty members who are doing projects in their classes. So a lot of us, I'm teaching early American history, and I have a collaborative digital project in the class, research project in the class. There are a lot of us who offer those kinds of digital projects, and the classes won't always be listed in the digital minor, the digital humanities minor, but we're out there. So for me, what I always tell history students is, learn every tool you can, become familiar with it. If you can get coding, great, get coding. If not, you know, learn the tools that you have at your disposal. Begin to create a portfolio of digital projects you've participated in. You can do that on your own. You can do it in internships. We have lots of internship opportunities. You can do it in class projects. Like, there are lots of ways of doing it, and I say all of the above.
Great.
Go for
Well, that sounds great. So this is, I've been talking to Dr. Rose Beiler from the Department of History here at UCF, and if you're interested in the kind of stuff she does, there's stuff online, or you can come and chat with her or
Yes,
something like that.
I would be thrilled to talk to
And,
students about it.
So that's our interview for today. Thank you very much.